be the 1958 proof-like penny. Now, this is no variety, nothing special you have to look for. It is just simply a 1958 penny. Now, this would have come out of the same proof-like set that you would have gotten the Death Dollar Totem Pole Silver Dollar in, which is a very desirable set, but it would seem that not too many of these survived in a high-grade state, because if you do happen to find one of these 1958 pennies and it scores high up in the PL 67 range, you can get around $405, and you can be sure that you can get some decent money if it's in a low grade, probably around $20 to $30 if people want to add it to their collection. Number 4 is going to be the 1953 shoulder fold penny. Now, I've discussed in several of my videos in the past that many of the Canadian denominations throughout the years of 1953 to 1955 have shoulder fold and no shoulder fold variations. Now, to tell the difference, basically, what you have to do is look at the last I in DEI. Now, if this I has flared out serifs at the end, it means it is a no shoulder fold. If it does not have the flared out serifs, if it is straight and blunt, then it means you have the shoulder fold, and that is the variety that you are looking for this 1953 proof-like penny. Now, if you can find one in a proof-like 67 grade, it can be worth all the way up to $1,600. Number 3 is going to be a much more modern proof penny, and that is the 2003P with an old effigy on the obverse, non-magnetic. Now, your chances of being able to cherry pick this out of a proof set are much higher, considering that it is much more recent than the other pennies we have discussed on this list. If you go into flea markets or maybe your local coin shop, there is a good chance they will sometimes have proof sets sitting around from this date range, and if you were able to find one of these 2003P proof sets with the old effigy and you maybe pulled out a magnet and tried sticking it to this penny and it did not stick, you might have yourself a holy grail of a proof set, because one of these in a PL67 can actually be worth $4,070. This is definitely one of the unicorns and holy grails of the modern Canadian penny era, and a lot of people spend their time looking for the 2006 pennies, but honestly, this is another great one to look for, regardless of whether you're a coin roll hunter or you are just a coin collector trying to find some rare varieties out there. Number 2 on this list is going to be the 2005P non-magnetic. Now, this is basically the proof counterpart to the 2006P non-magnetic, which is a circulation penny that I can say many coin roll hunters have spent hours and thousands of dollars sifting through pennies to find. It is probably the most valuable of the modern Canadian penny era. It can be worth anywhere from $20 to $50, even in a low-grade state. And this proof penny is definitely extremely rare and valuable as well, because if you can get one of these 2005P non-magnetics, it can be worth up to $4,270 in a PL67. So what I suggest, just like that other coin, is maybe if you go shopping at a coin shop, just bring a magnet with you. It's also good to have for testing silver. You want to make sure that you're not buying any aluminum or fake silver rounds or anything like that, depending on the coin shop or flea markets that you're dealing with. But if you bring this magnet with you, you can test some of these pennies. If it sticks to the pennies in the set, then you do not have yourself the good one. But if you have yourself these non-magnetics and that magnet is definitely not sticking, then you are probably going to want to purchase that set if the price range is anything reasonable. Well, we have breezed through this list and made it to number 1. I hope you guys enjoy these videos and I hope you find them helpful. I have made all sorts of videos in the past detailing all of the rare Canadian, American, Australian coins that you can find, whether you are searching through your pocket change, coin roll hunting, or you get collections handed down to you. There's a ton of valuable coins out there, and I definitely want to help and educate you guys on what to look for. I can personally vouch that many of these coins can be sold for the value that I state, or at least near the value that I state. Most of the coins that I post in my videos do have a premium, whether it's a coin roll hunting video or it's one of these breakdowns of the rare and valuable coins. So I would definitely appreciate if you would go check those videos out. But what do you say we get to number 1 on this list, which is going to be the 1954 no shoulder fold penny. Now, just like the 1953, there are 2 variations for the 1954. There is a shoulder fold and a no shoulder fold. To identify this, basically what you want to do is look at the last I in DEI, and if this I has flared out serifs, then you have yourself one extremely valuable proof penny, because in a PL67, it can be worth $4,300 and $80. Now, in most cases, I am not listing the low grade prices for these coins. A lot of the time when you pull proof coins out of sets, they will be in a higher grade. They might not be scoring PL 67, but even if they get somewhere around a 63, 64, you're definitely going to have yourself a good coin. It's worth the send off to be graded, and you're going to make some money off of it. Is the first year, which is 1870, which has a mintage of 2,800 overall. Now, you are going to be looking for a certain variety in this year. There are several different obverse varieties for all of the different dates in the early Canadian 5-cent pieces, a lot of them gravitating around Queen Victoria, and I'm going to be showing you the different busts as we go along. And the first one you're going to be looking for is the 1870 obverse 1, 1 over 1, or doubled 1. So this one can be a little tricky to identify because the 1 is basically going to appear as it has been double struck, but it is not as prominent as the doubling on the 7 would be in one of the other varieties. So you definitely want to give this one a good look over, but it can still be worth good money. Even in a low grade G4 state, it can be worth around $20. For a fine 12, it can fetch up to $50. And for an MS60, which is, as we know right now, the highest known graded example, it can fetch around $475. Now, currently there are no higher graded examples known, but let's say you could find one of these. It's not saying that they aren't out there. You could easily fetch up to $5,000 for an MS65. And hey, even in a low graded G4 state, they're still worth around $20, which is definitely a lot more than silver melt. That's the great thing about these 5-cent pieces, is that if you can score them through scrap silver purchases, you can actually make some good money back if you can identify the ones that are the unicorns. But that's the 1870 obverse 1 double 1. It's a pretty good one to find. It is the first year. All right, now we're going to go ahead to the 1872H, which has a mintage of 2000. Now, there are actually two varieties that you're going to be looking for in this year. Both of them are pretty darn valuable. Now, the first one you're going to look for is the second obverse variation, and it is the 7 over 7 or the doubled 7. Now, you can fetch around $25 for a G4, around $100 for an F12, which is fine, around $500 for an AU, and around $1,000 for an MS60, which, as we know right now, is the highest known graded examples. Now, the next one is the 1872H obverse 2, 2 over 2. Now, I should also mention that when I say the H, that stands for the H mint mark, which is located beneath the bow on the reverse of the coin, which indicates that it was minted at the Heaton Mint in Birmingham in England. All right, so going along is the second obverse 2 over 2 doubled 2 variation. So what you're basically doing is you're trying to identify doubling on either the 7 or the 2 in the 1872 date, and you probably want to get a microscope for that. It is definitely the easiest way to be able to identify it. But even in a G4 state, the obverse 2 doubled 2 can be worth $25. It can be worth $100 in an F12. It can be worth up to $500 for an almost uncirculated, and it can be worth up to $1,000 for an MS60. So those are both around in the same price ranges, and basically you're just looking for either doubling on the 7 or doubling on the 2 on the second obverse variation for the 1872H. Now, I definitely suggest at some point that you grab some kind of Canadian coin book. Even one of the older ones will do in helping you identify some of these different obverse variations, because it can be really tricky. Even with the examples that I'm throwing up on the screen, you probably want to have a reference in front of you to know for sure you have what you think you have. Now, moving ahead, we're going to go to the 1875 H mint mark. Now, the mintage for 1875 is 1,000, which is super, super low. Even if you have any of the 1875s, it is a pretty rare coin to have. Now, the variation that is valuable that you are looking for is the second obverse variety, large date. In terms of value, you can fetch around $150 for a G4, up to $650 for an F12, $4,300 for an almost uncirculated, and this one can go for $22,000 for an MS63, which is the highest known graded example. So if you were to find one that was in good condition and send it off and it got graded above MS63, it could be worth up above $50,000 or more. This one is super, super rare, a very low mintage. So if you get an 1875H, make sure to check that bad boy. All right, so another variation you want to look for in the 1875H is the second obverse variety, large date, doubled 5. Now this one isn't quite as rare as the one I mentioned previously, but it is still pretty valuable. It can be worth around $400 for a G4. It can be worth up to $725 for an F12. It can be worth $2,200 for an extremely fine example, and up to $5,000 for an almost uncirculated, which is the highest known graded example for the 1875H, second obverse variety, large date, doubled 5. Now, there are actually quite a few years they did not mint 5-cent pieces in Canada. In the 1800s and early 1900s, there are some date skips, like let's say between 1870, they might skip to 1872 as the next year. I'm not exactly sure why that is, if they were having problems with the minting processes, or maybe getting their dies, or if they just didn't feel like they needed to actually make them because they were just introducing them into circulation. But next up, we're going to skip to the 1883H obverse 4 variety. Now, the overall mintage for 1883H mint mark is 600. Now, that is super low. Now, for this one, you can fetch around $150 for a G4 example, around $500 for an F12, and up to $1,500 for an EF example, extremely fine. Now, there is not too many of these 1883s that are known to be out there, so regardless of which variety you have, it is going to be a very good find. But even in a super low grade tier like G4, it can be worth around $150. So this is one that you definitely want to keep your eyes out for, because it can be worth some good money even in a super low grade state. Now, next up is going to be one that is definitely one of the holy grails of the early Canadian 5-cent pieces, which is the 1884, which has a mintage of 200. Now, the variety that you're looking for the 1884, which is valuable, is the obverse 5 variety near 4. So this, even in a low-grade state, can be worth around $100 for a G4. You can fetch up to $300 for an F12. It can be worth $1,250 for an extremely fine, and this one can fetch up to $15,000 for an MS63. So this is one of the more valuable ones we've discussed so far, and as it goes up in the grading tiers, you can see the value increases pretty substantially. Now, another one that you can look for the year 1884, because it has such a low mintage, is the 1884 FAR 4, and this can come with the obverse 4 or obverse 5 variety because they are so rare. And this one can fetch you around $100 for a G4, around $300 for an F12, around $1,250 for an EF40, and around $15,000 for an MS63. So regardless, if you find yourself an 1884, just about any variety of them is going to be worth some pretty good money. Even in the low grade tiers, it's worth around $100. So if you find one of them, definitely send it off to be graded. And if it hits above that G mark, you could have some really good money on your hands. If you find one that's in good condition, you can make yourself pretty darn wealthy pretty quick. So that is a good one to look for sure. All right, we're really starting to get down to the nitty gritty. We only got 2 left on this top 10 list, and I'm going to skip ahead to 1909, which will actually feature King Edward VII on the obverse. Now, the mintage for 1909 is 1,891, so even as we go along, we keep the mintages super low on these 5-cent pieces. Now, the variety that you are looking for the 1909 is the round leaves cross bow tie variety. So there are several varieties in 1909, and you definitely want to make sure that you have this one. So the round leaves cross bow tie can fetch you around $250 for a VG8, around $750 for a VF20, up to $1,500 for an almost uncirculated. Now that is the highest known graded example right now is an AU, but if you were to find one of these in a higher graded state, which is possible, it could be worth up to easily $10,000 if it starts hitting in the MS range. Now this doesn't actually have anything listed for the G value, but I believe it's probably worth around $100 for the lowest graded example of this coin. So that's definitely a good one to look for. It has a super low mintage overall for 1909. And there is a small chance that if you get one of those 1909s, it could be this variety. So we have come to the final 5-cent piece on this list, which is definitely one of the holy grails of not only Canadian 5-cent pieces, but Canadian coins overall. And this is the 1921, which is the last year for the Canadian small 5-cent piece. Now this does have a relatively high mintage compared to the other ones, which I'm surprised. This one says it's minted at 2,582,495. Now, because it's the last year, I'm guessing that might have something to do with how it affects the value, or maybe not too many high-grade examples survive, but this one is definitely by far the most valuable one that I'm mentioning on this list today. For this one, you can fetch around $5,500 for a VG8 example, up to $8,500 for a VF20, $15,000 for an AU50, and this one can get you up to $65,000 for an MS65. So there are some high-grade known examples that are out there, which is pretty awesome. A lot of these cut off around the MS60 to MS63 mark, and there aren't any that are in better shape. Unfortunately, because these 5-cent pieces are so darn thin, they suffer a lot of damage. And because of that, not too many high-grade examples survived. So with this 1921, we're pretty lucky that there are some high-grade examples. If you were to find one that maybe scored above MS65, you could be talking 6 figures for that bad boy. But at least we have a high mintage for that one. It could be a good one. I also want to throw in a special mention that the 1919 does have one known certified example. Now, they didn't make any 5-cent pieces in the year 1919, but it is said that there are a few that might be out there, and if you did find one, it could be an absolute holy grail find, and it could be easily worth 5 or 6 figures. So keep an eye out if you ever find a 1919 5-cent piece. Definitely send that bad boy in to be graded. The 1946 6/6 nickel. Now, this is a variety that you are looking for with a repunch date. You're basically looking for either a double 6 or it just looks like a second 6 has been stamped over the original. This one can be worth around $2.90 in a VG, which is at the low end of the Sheldon scale, and it can be worth all the way up to $2,300 for an MS65 example for the 1946 6/6. Number 5 is another Canadian nickel that lives in great infamy when it comes to numismatics, and that is the 1947 dot. Now, there is a whole lot of varieties for the year 1947 when it comes to Canadian coins. There are plain varieties, there are maple leafs, there are varieties that exist around the 7, but for the nickel, the most rare and desirable variety that you want to look for is the 1947 dot. Now, basically what you want to do is you want to look to the right-hand bottom of the 7, and you want to look for a small dot, what would almost appear like a die chip, that would be in a similar place to the maple leaf if it was a 1947 maple leaf nickel. Now, this can be worth around $27.80 for a VG example, so that is at the very bottom of the Sheldon scale. So if you find one of these that is heavily worn and circulated and beat up, you can still make some decent money off of it, and it can be worth all the way up to $2,850 for an MS65 example. Now, this one is a little bit more rare than the extra waterline, but I know these are out there and people have found them, and there is still a chance that you could find one of these as well. And if you did find one of these nickels and it scored somewhere in the middle of the grading scale, then you can still make some really good money off of it. Number 4 is the 1951 high relief nickel. Now, I mentioned earlier that the year 1951 has a low relief and a high relief variety. The high relief is extremely rare, and from what I have heard from fellow collectors, the story goes that basically when these coins were minted, there was a private collector that purchased most of these rolls for his private collection. I'm not too sure if it was the gentleman that owned the Pittman collection. I believe his name is John Pittman. But regardless, these 1951 high relief nickels are basically holy grails. Your chance of ever finding these in circulation is pretty much slim to nil, but that is not saying that none of them are out there. Most of them have been accounted for and graded at this point, but if you did happen to find one in circulation, you can get around $441 for a VG example, so that is at the very bottom of the Sheldon scale, and you are getting almost $500 for a 5-cent coin. And then it can be worth all the way up to $4,570 for an MS65 example. Most of these have been graded at this point and are in high grade states, but that is not saying that you cannot get lucky and maybe find one of these bad boys out there, whether you're coin roll hunting or maybe sifting through some pocket change one day. Number 3 is the 1965 large bead nickel. Now, very similar to the 1973 large bead Canadian quarter, which is a very infamous Canadian quarter that you can look for. It's usually worth anywhere from $50 to $300, even in a low grade state. The 1965 large bead nickel is very similar to identify. Basically, what you want to look for is the beads to be much larger and closer, almost touching the outside rim of the coin. Also, the queen's bust will be slightly larger. There may be more detail in her hair as well. Those are some of the dead giveaways you can use to be able to identify the large beads. There are a few other varieties for 1965 as well, like an attached or detached jewel, but basically if you find the large bead, you have yourself a very valuable nickel. Now this can be worth all the way up to $490 for a VF example, so that is just a touch above the bottom of the Sheldon scale, and it can be worth $5,200 for an MS65 example of the 1965 large beads. Number 2 is going to be the 1953 shoulder fold far leaf. Now, I mentioned earlier on in this list the different varieties between the shoulder fold and no shoulder fold for the early Queen Elizabeth nickels. Now, a lot of these 1953s and 1954s have been religiously fished out of circulation. They are chrome plated and they are 12 edgers, and they stand out like a sore thumb. So whether you are a coin roll hunter, a bank teller, or you just work with change a lot, you are going to pull these things out because they stand out much more than the average nickel. But that is not saying that you can never find one of these. It is a rare variety, and most of the average people out there will not know how to identify it. Now, for the 1953 shoulder fold, what you are looking for is basically a straight eye in the DEI, meaning the serifs will not flare out at the end. It is basically straight and blunt, and you are also looking for the far leaf variety. Now, the best way that I could describe the far leaf variety is it basically has a little bit less detail and is more shaded on the inside of the leaves. In terms of value, this nickel can bring you up to $68 for a VG example, which is at the very bottom of the Sheldon scale, and all the way up to $6,100 for an MS65 example for the 1953 shoulder fold far leaf. Well, we have made it to number 1 on this list. We have covered some of the most rare Canadian nickel varieties to look for. In the future, I'm definitely going to make some more lists where I cover some of the early Canadian nickels, like some of the small fish scales and the George V era. But for this list, I thought it would be pretty well suited to do from the year 1937 onwards, which is the George VI era. But for number 1 on this list, it is going to be the 1953 no shoulder fold near leaf, which is basically the exact opposite of number 2 on this list. Now, for the 1953 no shoulder fold, basically what you are looking for is for the ends of the eye in the DEI to flare out on the serifs. It is not going to be straight and blunt like the shoulder fold is, and you are looking for the near leaf. The near leaf, I would describe, has slightly more detail than the far leaf and is a little bit lighter on the insides of the leaves. In terms of value, this nickel can bring you around $100 in a very good state, so that's not too bad. That's a pretty good return for a 5-cent investment if you do happen to find one of these coin roll hunting. And if you happen to find one of these in your pocket change, you are one lucky devil. And this nickel can bring you all the way up to $7,000 for an MS65. So it is the most valuable nickel on this list, $7,000. And it is not a key date. It is not impossible to find. There is a chance. I have found hundreds and hundreds of 1953 nickels in my coin roll hunts. I mean, they get a little bit scarcer as time goes on, but they are still out there. So make sure to check every single one of them on the DEI. Check that eye and make sure that it is not a holy grail, because you do not accidentally want to throw a coin that is worth a lot of money back into circulation or accidentally pass it and just throw it in with the rest of your collection. Now, I do want to make a few honorable mentions as well. This was a top 10 list, but there are a few more varieties within this date range that I wanted to throw in here. Now, one of them is going to be the 1957 bugtail nickel. Now, basically, to identify this variety, what you are looking for is a little die chip on the end of the beaver's tail. On the reverse of the coin, it looks kind of like there's a little bug stuck to the beaver's tail. Now, this can be worth $2 in a VG state, all the way up to $500 for an MS65. Now, another really good error or variety that you can look for is the 1962 double date. Now, this has extreme machine doubling on the date. I have actually found a few of these, so it is definitely not impossible for you to find, and it can be worth around $1 in a VG state. So even if you happen to find one that's in the middle of the Sheldon grading scale, it can be worth some pretty decent money. But this nickel can be worth all the way up to $345 for an MS65. And basically, to identify it, all you're looking for is machine doubling on the date of 1962 on the reverse of the coin. And the last nickel that I want to make an honorable mention of is the 1990 bare belly. Now, I have actually found a few of these, and there can be partial bare bellies or full bare bellies. And if you happen to find one of these and it is a full bare belly, it can be worth around $5 for an extremely fine example. So that is slightly above the bottom of the Sheldon scale, and all the way up to $375 for an MS65. Now, this is the most modern nickel on this list, and there's still a pretty good chance that you could find one of these and it could score in the low MS range. If you happen to score a roll of them, an uncirculated roll from a bank, and you found one of them inside, you could make some really good money. If you got a couple of them and they scored MS64 or MS63, you could still make hundreds and hundreds of dollars. So always keep your eyes open. Always educate yourself when it comes to coins, because knowledge is power, and when you know what to look for and what to identify, you might be able to make some really good money one day. Number 10, which is going to be the 1951 double die dime. Now, 1951 has an overall mintage of 15,079,265. Now, this is actually a DDR. The most common place for the doubling to occur is on the reverse of the coin. That's not saying that it cannot occur on the obverse, but usually it will occur on the date, or it will occur on the Canada underneath the blue nose. Now, in terms of value, this dime can actually fetch you $10 in a VF condition. So that is anywhere from 3 to 5 times spot value, which isn't too bad. If you find one of these in your pocket change or coin roll hunting, it's a nice little profit. And it can be worth all the way up to $450 for an MS66 example. Number 9 is the 1956 dot dime. Now, the overall mintage for 1956 is 16,732,844. Now, this variety is extremely rare, and basically to identify it, what you want to look for is a little dot in between the 9 and the 5 underneath on the date. Now, one of these can fetch you anywhere from $11 in a VF state all the way up to $450 in an MS65. Number 8 is one of the well-known key dates for most of the Canadian denominations, and you can be sure that if you find any of these in the wild, it will fetch a pretty hefty premium, and that is the 1948. With an extremely low mintage figure of 422,741, it can be worth $15 in a VF condition. So if you find a 1948 in your pocket change or coin roll hunting, that is a nice hefty little profit, at least $10 to $12. And then it can be worth all the way up to $800 for an MS65 example. I'm honestly surprised that this 1948 is not worth more in a high-grade state. Considering it has such a low mintage figure and its scarcity when it comes to high-grade examples, it may actually be a good time to pick one of these up. If you do now, you never know what it might be worth in 20 or 30 years. It might actually be worth like $2,000 to $5,000 at that point. The 1948 is a very well-known, well-sought-after date. People want these for their registries and collections, and that is actually a pretty reasonable, affordable coin for having such a low mintage figure. Number 7 is going to be the 1938 Canadian dime. The overall mintage for 1938 is 4,197,323. Now, one of these can be worth around $6 in a low-grade state, so about 2 to 3 times spot value, and it can be worth all the way up to $2,500 for an MS66 example. Now, the difference between an MS65 and MS66 is extremely substantial. A lot of the time, when it comes to these older coins, you will see massive price jumps if you go from 65 to 66. So finding an MS66 in an uncirculated roll out there or anywhere basically is going to be extremely tough, if not impossible for anybody. But you never know. There's always a possibility that maybe one has been sitting around in a collection or something like that. And if you ever find one that looks like it is in really good condition, definitely send it off to be graded or get a second opinion. Number 6 is the 1938 re-engraved date. Now, for the date sequence of 1938, 1939, and 1940, they are re-engraved date varieties. The overall mintage, like I mentioned in the last coin, is 4,197,323 for 1938. So this variety is included in that mintage figure. The easiest way to be able to identify these re-engraved date varieties is basically just to match it to doubling. It is very similar to machine doubling. Basically, they just re-engraved the dies to add more detail to them because they were pressing so many of them. Now, the 1938 re-engraved date can be worth $15 in a low-grade state, and it can be worth all the way up to $1,600 for an MS-65. And I also just want to mention that the 1939 is just about as valuable as the 1938 re-engraved date. It's worth about $10 in a low-grade state and $2,500 for an MS-65 example. So basically, for the date sequences of 1938, 1939, and 1940, you are looking for re-engraved date varieties for all three of those, and they all can be worth a pretty hefty premium. Number 5 is the 1915 Canadian dime. Now, this has an extremely low mintage, even for early Canadian coinage. It has a mintage figure of 688,057. Now, it can be worth around $12 in a low-grade state and all the way up to $4,000 for an MS-65. Now, you are going to be extremely hard-pressed to find any Canadian coins from the George V era or earlier that will score in the MS range. They are a lot of the time accounted for already, and usually if you do find them in your pocket change with a while, they will be ground down to a pulp and there will be no more detail on them, and they are basically just worth melt value. But these ones are still worth looking out for. They are definitely rare, and when they have such a low mintage figure, they are extremely collectible, and people always want them for collections, and a lot of the time they're actually willing to pay more than the values that I'm actually discussing with you today. Well, we are starting to get up into the nitty-gritty right now. So number 4 is going to be the 1903. Now, the 1903 has a mintage of 500,000. It was also struck at the Heaton Mint, and it has a separate mintage figure for the Heaton Mint strike. Now, when it comes to the 1903 Canadian strike, it is worth around $22 for a VG8 example, so that is at the absolute bottom of the Sheldon scale, and it can be worth all the way up to $6,000 for an MS-65. Now, this is an extremely early dime, so like I mentioned earlier, finding one of these that is going to score in a high-grade state is going to be pretty tricky, but if you find one and it even scores in a fine or a AU condition, it is still going to be worth thousands of dollars, so always keep your eyes open for this stuff because you never know what you can find in your pocket change. Number 3 is going to be one of the most well-known and infamous Canadian dimes of all time. I've covered it in some of my other videos, and there is just absolutely no way you can leave it out of a top 10 Canadian dime list. And that is going to be the Canadian 1969 large date dime. Now, I can personally say that myself and other coin roll hunters has sifted through millions and millions of dollars, if not more, in Canadian dimes to try and find these things. They are some of the holy grails of Canadian coins, and there are only a few that have been found and are graded and accounted for. Now, the overall mintage for 1969 is 55,833,929. Now, if you were to find one of these unicorn dimes, it can be worth anywhere from $13 in a very fine state, so that's pretty near the bottom of the Sheldon scale, and it can be worth all the way up to $24,000 in an AU state. Now, when it comes to identifying this, basically the easiest way that I would say is you want to have a 1968 dime next to it, and you want to compare the date. Now, if the date looks more similar to the 1968, then you have yourself one of the rarest coins of all time. If the date looks a little bit smaller than that, then you have a very common coin that is worth 10 cents. It's very funny how that works, and the difference between 10 cents and hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of dollars, right? But always keep your eyes out. Always hold on to these kind of coins that I'm saying and check them under a microscope. Check them up close on your phone. You should always do your due diligence and make sure that you are not accidentally releasing a coin that is worth a lot of money back into the wilds of circulation. Number 2 is the 1913 broadleaves dime. Now, the overall mintage for 1913 is 3,613,937, and there are two different varieties for that date. There are a small leaf and a broadleaf variety. When it comes to identifying the rare one, which is the broadleaf, basically what you are looking for is a single leaf that almost resembles a maple leaf. It will have more detail on it, and the small leaves will be separate. It will resemble more of what I would say is like a branch. Now, when it comes to value, this is the most valuable dime in a low-grade state on this list by far. It can be worth around $200 in a VG8, which is at the absolute bottom of the Sheldon scale. So if you were to make a scrap silver purchase and find one of these bad boys, which is not completely out of the question, then you can make some good money off of it. Because a lot of the time, if you go onto eBay or you go onto sites like ATMEX, you can buy scrap silver. And a lot of the time when these big companies are moving such massive amounts of silver, they don't really check for varieties and errors like this. They just kind of get stuff in and then send it right back out. So always keep your eyes open when you are buying scrap silver, that you are not getting a coin that is worth thousands and thousands of dollars. Well, we have made it to number 1 on this list. I really hope you guys enjoy this video, and I hope you find it helpful. I'm definitely going to be making more videos covering Canadian dimes in the future. We have the pre-1900 Canadian dimes, as well as some of the errors and varieties you can look for in your pocket change. And if you guys would like to find out some of the values of your American coins or foreign coins, I definitely suggest that you go check out my playlist, Rare and Valuable American Coins in History and the Most Rare and Valuable Australian Coins. So number 1 on this list is going to be a date and variety that is extremely infamous among several Canadian denominations. From the penny to the quarter, if you find one of these, a lot of the time you are going to be what I would consider to be decently wealthy after. So number 1 is going to be the 1936 dot dime. Now, when it comes to the story of the 1936 dot coins, it is estimated that somewhere around 191,237 were actually minted, but there are actually only 5 known specimen examples that have survived over the years. It was said that some were put out into circulation, but all of the ones that are counted and graded are all graded SP, and that means they are specimen examples. So it is most likely either false that they minted that many, or they melted them all down. Now, to identify this variety, what you want to look for is a little dot underneath the sash or ribbon on the reverse of the coin. I guess the mint put those there to identify some of the coins that were actually made in the year 1937, but the date still said 1936 on them. So if you were to ever find one of these, the most likely scenario is that you are going to pull one out of a specimen set. Now, there are only a few known graded examples right now, but it can be worth anywhere from $144,000 for an SP63 all the way up to $250,000 for an SP66 example. With the 1915, which has an extremely low mintage of 242,382. So that is one of the lowest mintages that I have seen or heard of in almost all of the Canadian coin denominations post 1900. That is a unicorn for sure. Now, this one can fetch you a pretty good price even in a low quality condition. You can get around $35 for a VG8, which is a pretty well-worn circulated coin. You can get up to $1,750 for an almost uncirculated. So as we go up in the grading tiers, the value starts to increase pretty substantially on these early date coins. You can get yourself around $3,500 for an MS60 and up to $14,000 for an MS64. So if your grandpa hands you down some coins and you find a 1915 in a coin flip and it looks like it's in pretty good shape, I definitely suggest you send that in to be graded, because you could have something that is truly worth a fortune. Now, one thing you might notice in a lot of the quarters that I'm covering today is a lot of them have very low mintages. Even by Canadian standards, usually it's pretty hard to find Canadian coins under $1 million, and when you do, a lot of the time they will have a super high premium. So next up is going to be the 1921, which has a mintage of 597,337. Now, because of this low mintage, it gives it a pretty good premium. Even in a circulated worn condition, it can be worth around $20 for a VG example. You can fetch up to $850 for a almost uncirculated. You can get up to $3,500 for an MS63, and you can fetch up to $1,200 for an MS65. So we'll keep it going with the 1927, which has an even lower mintage than the 1921, minted at 468,096. Now, it can be worth around $45 for a worn VG example. You can get around $750 for an AU. It can be worth around $2,500 for an MS63, and it can be worth all the way up to $7,500 for MS65 examples. Now we're going to skip ahead 6 years to 1934, which has an incredibly low mintage of 384,350. So not too many of the 1934 quarters were struck. It isn't worth too much in a VG condition. You can only get around $10 for it, which is just pretty much around melt price. But the value goes up pretty high as you go up in the grading tiers. It can be worth up around $190 for an almost uncirculated. You can get $800 for an MS63 and up to $6,000 for an MS65. So that is a huge jump in value there between the MS63 and MS65. You're talking more than $5,000 increase there. So next up is going to be a quarter that should come as no surprise to any experienced or seasoned Canadian coin collector, and that is the 1936 with the dot, the bar, or the dot and bar variations. Now, the easiest way to be able to identify this is to be able to locate a small dot in between the two sashes on the ribbon underneath the date 1936. And the easiest way to be able to identify the bar is it's almost like a small die chip or line running in between the two sashes. Now, if you have yourself the 1936 dot, you can fetch yourself around $45 for a VG example, around $850 for an AU, and up to $5,000 for an MS63. Now, there has been a few specimens that have been known to have these errors, and they can go upwards into the six figures. There's one that was known to sell at an auction for $100,000, and in terms of rarity and scarcity, nothing quite really falls into that category like the 1936 dot specimens. Now, for the 1936 bar variation, it's not worth quite as much as the dot, but it can be worth up to $30 for a VG8. You can get up to $300 for an AU example, and you can get yourself up to $1,700 for an MS63. Now, if you don't hear me ringing out any of the values for some of these MS65 coins, the most likely reason is because there aren't any that are attributed to that high of a mint state. The most high-grade state that they have been attributed to is probably an MS63 or MS64. So the highest known grades for the 1936 dot and 1936 bar are both MS63s. Now, another one you can look for is the 1936 with the dot and bar variation. You can get around $100 for a VG8 example, and it can be worth up to $1,000 for an extremely fine example, and there aren't too many that are known or have been found that are attributed higher than that. Alrighty, so we're at about the halfway point for this top 10 list, and we're going to go to the 1938, which is minted at $3,149,245. Now, it is not worth too much in a VG state, only around $9, but it increases in value a little bit as we go up in the grading tiers. It can be worth around $40 for a almost uncirculated, $150 for an MS63, and it can get all the way up to $3,000 if you have an MS66, which is an extremely good looking 1938 if you have one of those. In several of my previous videos, I have talked about the 1947 Canadian coins. There are a whole lot of variations to look for, and the quarter is definitely no exception. Now, I don't want to get too deep into it, but in 1948, the Canadian Mint had troubles getting dies for the reverse. So due to that, what they did is improvise, and instead of actually putting the date on originally, what they did was put a little maple leaf beside the 7 in the date 1947. So there are a couple variations you can look for, the most basic of which is the 1947 without a maple leaf. Now that is minted at $1,524,555. Now, it's not worth too much when it doesn't have a maple leaf or any of the special attributions, but it can be worth a little bit if you have it in a higher grade tier. Now, it can be worth around $8 for a well-worn circulated VG example. You can fetch up to $40 for an AU example, $120 for an MS63, and it can be worth up to $1,200 for an MS65, and that's actually just for the 1947 plain. No maple leaf, no nothing. Now, next up, I'm going to talk to you about the 1947 dot. Now, I'm not too sure exactly how this error came about, but most likely it's a problem with die deterioration, or it's just simply a die chip, but it is super well known for a lot of the Canadian coins in 1947 to have this error. The nickels also have them, I believe, as well, and it usually adds a pretty good premium to them, just like this quarter, because you can fetch around $110 for a VG example. you can get up to $600 for an almost uncirculated, $2,500 for an MS63, and up to $5,000 for an MS64, which I believe is the highest known graded example. And that's a huge jump from MS63 to MS65. That value doubles right there. So that is crazy. All right, next up is going to be another coin that should be no surprise to any of the experienced Canadian coin collectors out there, and that is the 1948, which is another well-known key date for most of the Canadian denominations, and quarters are definitely no exception. It's not quite as low as some of the other denominations like dollars and half dollars, but it is definitely one you should still keep an eye out for, especially if you can get it in an uncirculated condition or mint state. But it doesn't have too much of a premium. It's only worth around $8 in a VG, so just a tad over silver melt. It can be worth around $40 for an almost uncirculated, $150 for an MS63, $550 for an MS65, and you can fetch all the way up to $1,000 for an MS66, which is usually the highest grade tier you'll see the 1948 in. It is pretty scarce and extremely well known and rare, so good luck finding one for MS65 or MS66 that isn't already graded. If you do, send that sucker in. And here we are at the end of this list. Can you believe it? Number 10 on my top 10 list. Now, I don't usually go in any specific order. I don't go from like least to most valuable or most to least. I usually just go through the years and ring them all off and give you as much information as I can. But for the years 1951 and 1952, for Canadian quarters, there are some variations that gravitate around the relief. Though you can probably fetch a pretty penny for most of these different variations if they are in the high MS states, they aren't actually worth too much. There is one that you want to look out for over all of the other ones, and that is going to be the 1951 low relief. Now, it can get a little confusing and tricky even for me with some of these early proof-like strikes. Now, you would think that when you send a proof-like strike in that it would get the designation as PL, but that isn't necessarily the case. Sometimes the mint would actually throw circulation strikes in. So there are some cases where you might send a coin that you think is a circulation strike in and it might come back as a proof-like, and there are some cases where you might send a proof-like coin in and it'll come back with a circulation grade like an MS or an AU or an EF or something like that. It is very confusing with some of these early Canadian proof sets. They had to deal with some serious stumbles, and there was some serious shenanigans in the early days with some of these mintages just being so insanely low. Take the 1991 quarter, for example, minted somewhere around 400,000. You think that the mint would have learned from their lessons in the early 1900s, but then they go and they make a modern gem for us just like that. The 1992 Loon Reverse $1 coin. Now in 1992 there are a few designs, but the most valuable and desirable of which is the one with a loon on the reverse, which is the common loonie design that you probably know. Now you're going to find with a lot of Canadian loonies, if they are in a low grade state on the Sheldon scale, they are actually not going to be worth anything more than face value unless maybe they are colored loonie. You might be able to get a couple extra dollars for it, especially if you sell it to American collectors, because they cannot get them over there. It's a lot harder for them to be able to find them, and they are much more common for us to find here in Canada. But usually when you are discussing loonies and value, when it comes to the low grade loonies, they are only going to be worth about $1, and that includes most of the loonies on this list. So the 1992 is going to be worth about $1 in a low grade state, but it can be worth all the way up to $98 for an MS66. Now, I have found 1992 commemoratives that are definitely in the mid-MS range, so there is a chance that maybe if you found a roll of one of these, or maybe there's just been one that's been sitting around for 20 some odd years, that maybe you could get one and it could be worth up to $100. Number 4 on this list is going to be the 2017 Loonie, and this is with a Loon Reverse. There are also a few commemorative designs in 2017. I believe the most notable is the Canada 150 Year Celebration Loonie. Now, this can be worth up to $5 for an MS63. Now, this is a fairly recent Looney. It's only from 2017, and there's actually a decent chance that you may be able to score a roll of these uncirculated from the bank still. I have actually found coins that are much older uncirculated from banks. I've gotten 2005 nickel rolls. I have even gotten 1967 uncirculated rabbit nickel rolls. So it is absolutely insane some of the stuff you can find that has just been sitting around in bank vaults for all of these years. But there is a decent chance, especially if a coin is only 5 years old, that you might be able to find one in a high mint state. And if you were able to find one of the 2017 Loon Reverse $1 coins, it could be worth all the way up to $100 for an MS65. So that is not actually that high on the MS grading scale. It can go all the way up to a 70-point system, I believe, and a lot of the other loonies actually have to be MS66 or higher. So this is definitely a good one to look for, the 2017 Loon Reverse $1 coin. Number 3 on this list is going to be the 1988 Looney. Now, this is the second year for Looney, and they did not make quite as many as they did in the first year. When they started making Loonies in 1987, they pumped out a whole lot, and it is definitely going to be tricky to find one of these in a high mint state. Your best chance is probably going to be if you get a collection handed down to you, or maybe you get lucky and you hit the Holy Grail and you find an uncirculated roll from a bank. I have found older uncirculated rolls before, so I'm going to say that it's not completely impossible. But in terms of value, the 1988 Loon Reverse Looney can be worth around $105 for an MS66, which is at the higher end of the Sheldon scale. Number 2 on this list is going to be an extremely recent Looney that has been released. It is actually one of the colored Loonies that has been released in the last couple years. The Royal Canadian Mint has been releasing all sorts of amazing colored Looney designs, and I believe they actually just released one. I think it is the Oscar Peterson, and it has a touch of purple color in it, and it is absolutely awesome. I love the Canadian colored coins, and I love what they are doing. I pray that they will release a colored nickel before it goes out of circulation. I've heard whispers and rumors that they may be taking the Canadian nickel out of circulation anytime now, and I hope that is not the case, but if they do, I really, really hope that they release a colored nickel before they do. But in terms of value, the 2021 Canadian Klondike Colored Looney can be worth around $27 for an MS64. So I'm guessing that this has a bit of a lower mintage, especially for the colored. Usually they release them at about $2 million for the colored and $1 million for the uncolored. But I'm not too sure why it has such a premium, even in a lower mint state like MS64. But apparently this 2021 Klondike Colored can be worth all the way up to $106 for an MS66. So if you were able to score an uncirculated roll and you sent it in and they all scored an MS66, you could be making thousands of dollars off of a Looney roll. So that is definitely a good investment. I'm not too sure where this price comes from. I actually got the prices on this list from Coins in Canada, and they update their coin prices just about every day. They fluctuate and go up and down depending on the market. So apparently this is a valuable Looney to look for, and it is only a couple years old. So always keep your eyes open because you never know what you can find. But we have made it to number 1 on this list already. Can you believe it? Only 5 Loonies, and I had to really cherry pick to be able to find these. Honestly, I think the Loonies are a little bit underrated. I think they're going to become a lot more valuable over the next couple decades, especially. They're going to become very desirable to collectors. The colored ones are beautiful, and people are going to want them, especially US collectors. So they are definitely under the radar, and you should hold on to the ones that I am mentioning on this list, like this one right here, which is number 1, and that is going to be the 2005 Terry Fox Looney No Grass variation. Now, there are a few variations for 2005, and one of them is the Terry Fox commemorative. Now, if you are not familiar with Terry Fox, he is a very iconic Canadian. He actually tragically got cancer and lost his leg, and in his battle against cancer and to raise money for cancer awareness, he ran across Canada and raised a lot of money for the cause, and unfortunately passed away. And we actually have a run here in Canada. Schools participate in an event where all the kids get together every year during the anniversary, and they basically just run laps around the field to commemorate Terry Fox, and I think it's absolutely awesome. I did it every year when I was in school, and the Canadian Mint made a Looney to commemorate it as well. And this Looney can be pretty valuable. Now, what you want to look for basically is at the feet of Terry Fox, there is a few varieties. There is a grass variety, which the grass will be much more detailed and long, and there is a no grass variety where it will be much more bare, and you will basically just see the plain field. Now, in terms of the no grass 2005 Terry Fox Looney, it can be worth all the way up to $150 in an MS66. So this could actually be a great loonie if you were to go shopping online on some coin shops websites and you're able to buy some rolls of Terry Fox loonies, break them open and cherry pick for some no grass varieties. You could actually make some really good money. I bet you that you could probably find some rolls of these for anywhere from $100 to $200. They're still around. I've seen them out there. You usually have to pay a little bit of a premium for uncirculated rolls when they're a little bit older like this, but there's still a good chance that you could find these varieties in an uncirculated roll. That's not bad. $150 for a $1 investment, if you ask me. Because so few of the German Toonies were produced, it has made them highly collectible and sought after and added to their value. Though the specifications are the same between the Canadian and German 1996 Toonies, the easiest way to distinguish between them is their finish. The Canadian Toonies are much more shiny and polished, and the German coins will have much more dull and matte finish with grainy lines on the outer rings, somewhat resembling bullion coins. Now, even in lower grade states, the 1996 German planchette Toonies carry a premium. One in a very good to very fine state can go for $10 to $30, with high MS examples going for $100 to $300. Now next up, we are going to be discussing the 2002 50th anniversary of Queen Elizabeth's Jubilee Dot in H Toonie. Now, the Canadian Mint released a commemorative Jubilee design to celebrate Queen Elizabeth's 50th anniversary. The total mintage for the 2002 Jubilee Toonie is 27,020,000, and this variety is included in that mintage. Now, it can be identified by locating a small dot under the center line in the letter H in Elizabeth. Though it's not exceptionally valued right now, this Toonie has amazing potential. If you find one in a very good to very fine circulated state, you can fetch anywhere from $5 to $10, with MS63 to MS65 examples going anywhere from $20 to $50. All Canadian $2 coins made from 1996 to 2010 have 16 serrations along the outer rim, but in the year 2012, they officially switched to 14. In 2010, the Mint struck Toonies with both 14 and 16 serrations. The more rare of these is the 14 variety. Even in low-grade states, it can be worth anywhere from $5 to $10, with low MS examples going for $20 to $50, and an MS65 being worth as much as $150. Number 4 is the 2012 HMS Shannon Extra Sail with Security Mark. In the year 2012, the Royal Canadian Mint released a Toonie design to commemorate a historic battle between the Canadian and American ships off the coast of Boston in the War of 1812. The Canadian Lido-class frigate was called the HMS Shannon. The Mint also added security features to the reverse of the coin in 2012, on the top and bottom containing holographic maple leaves. Now, the variety you are looking for with the 2012 HMS Shannon is called the Extra Sail variety, and it can be identified by looking at the top right-hand corner of the core for an extra sail along the HMS Shannon's masts. Now, right now, this Toonie is not super valuable, but I think there is a lot of potential with most of these. I think in 20 or 30 years, the value of these is going to rise exponentially, especially as they all become accounted for and people coin roll hunt them and find them in their pocket change. There will be less and less of them out there, and the value will rise, especially on the high-grade examples. Now, in a low-grade circulated state, you can fetch anywhere from $5 to $10 for one of these varieties, and you can get anywhere for up to $75 for an MS65. Now, last up on this list is the 2017 Dance of the Spirits Glow in the Dark. The world's first glow-in-the-dark circulation coin, the 2017 Dance of the Spirits Toonie is as revolutionary as it is sought after. With an unknown mintage far less than its uncolored counterpart, it is truly an amazing coin whose value has and will see increases due to its popularity. Now, right now, the book prices will say that a low-grade circulated example will only be worth around $5 for a VG to VF, But I think honestly, it is worth a little bit more than that. These things are super popular and sought after. I think you'll have no problem getting anywhere from $10 to $15 for one of these on eBay, and you'll probably be hard pressed to find one of them for any cheaper than that online. They are super popular. There are still a few uncirculated rolls of these out there, and if you were able to score one of these, you might just hit the jackpot, because an MS65 example of one of these can fetch you from $30 to $50, with MS67 examples going for as much as $120. So if you were to get a whole roll of these, you might be able to make a good couple bucks, especially if you scored one at the bank. But I think, unfortunately, most of the rolls of these glow-in-the-dark Toonies have been accounted for at this point. I know they had some at Coins Unlimited about a year ago. I think they were charging about $150, and man, do I wish that I picked one of those up.